Imagine this. Beijing announces that every cargo ship and tanker entering Taiwan must submit its documents to Chinese authorities. Vessels that refuse may be boarded, diverted, or denied future access to Chinese ports. No missile has been fired. No invasion fleet has sailed. China calls the measure routine law enforcement. Companies begin pausing voyages. Insurers raise premiums. Taiwan rejects the order. American and Japanese officials meet urgently. Has the blockade already started? To answer that question, we need to separate three different operations. A quarantine is an attempt to control selected ships, aircraft, cargo, or people while claiming that no armed conflict exists. China could present inspections as customs or maritime safety enforcement. Coast Guard and civilian agencies would lead, while the People's Liberation Army remained close enough to intimidate Taiwan and deter outsiders. A military blockade, on the other hand, is different. It uses armed forces to deny access. It could involve naval and air patrols, mines, missile strikes, cyber operations, and attacks on ports or defenses. A limited blockade might close selected ports, restrict particular cargo, or cover only part of the island's approaches. A full blockade would seek to sever maritime and air access across the island. The difference is not cosmetic. The more complete the operation, the greater the force requirement and the risk of a wider war. An invasion is more demanding. Crossing the strait, defeating Taiwan's forces, landing and sustaining troops, and occupying the island. These are not interchangeable labels, and calling an operation law enforcement does not settle its legality. The label is part of the contest because it influences whether foreign governments and commercial companies treat the crisis as coercion, armed conflict, or an internal Chinese administrative measure. Under the Sanremo framework, a formal blockade must be declared, notified, effective, and applied impartially. It cannot be designed to starve civilians or create civilian harm excessive in relation to the expected military advantage. The manual is an authoritative expert restatement, not itself a treaty. This scenario is not built from theory alone. China has repeatedly rehearsed operations around Taiwan involving the Navy, Air Force, Rocket Force, and Coast Guard. The Pentagon assessed that the 2024 Joint Sword exercises practiced maritime and air superiority, blockading key ports and precision strikes. Taiwan's 2025 National Defense Report said Strait Thunder 2025 Alpha simulated a blockade of waterways and energy imports. The pattern continued. In July 2026, Beijing announced that Coast Guard patrols east of Taiwan would become routine, following a June maritime traffic enforcement operation. A US-China Economic and Security Review Commission staff assessment argued that these activities assert Chinese enforcement authority while avoiding the appearance of military escalation. That does not prove Beijing has selected quarantine as its preferred strategy. Exercises demonstrate preparation and signaling, not wartime competence or a final political decision. But they show why an ambiguous first move is credible. Coast Guard cutters can stop a ship. Maritime militia can complicate identification. PLA aircraft and warships can remain behind them, making every attempt to resist a decision about escalation. Let's look at the first 72 hours if this scenario takes effect. The first effect would probably be commercial, not military. Beijing could announce inspection rules, temporary exercise zones, or an exclusion area. It might intercept one non-compliant vessel to make the threat credible. At the same time, cyber and electronic attacks could disrupt ports, communications, banking, or electricity without revealing the full limits of the campaign. Shipping lines would not wait for perfect legal clarity. They would ask whether crews, cargo, and vessels were insurable. Some would pose calls to Taiwan. Airlines could reroute. Markets would reprice the risk immediately. This matters because China would not need to stop every ship. Taiwan's ports handled roughly $517 billion in trade in 2024, concentrated in a small number of export facilities. Commercial caution could perform part of the coercive work before the PLA tried to seal the island. Taiwan would mobilize military and civil defense systems. Washington would consult allies. Japan would assess risk to its territory, sea lanes, and US bases. And every actor would watch the first challenged vessel because that encounter could define the crisis. Taiwan is highly dependent on imported energy. Natural gas is the sharpest short-term vulnerability. The US Energy Information Administration reports that Taiwan produced less than half of 1% of its natural gas consumption in 2024. 78% of that gas was used for electricity generation. In 2026, Taiwan's Ministry of Economic Affairs estimated that available gas stocks covered about 10 to 11 days of use. But saying Taiwan collapses in 11 days is simply wrong. 10 to 11 days is an estimate for natural gas inventory. It is not a countdown for total electricity, oil, coal, food, military endurance, or political survival. The actual timeline would depend on stocks when the crisis began, electricity rationing, industrial shutdowns, damage to terminals and ports, and whether any resupply continued. Taiwan also imports crude oil through three principal ports and receives all of its liquefied natural gas through three regasification terminals. Concentration creates vulnerability, but it also tells Taipei exactly what must be protected, dispersed, or rationed. The pressure would be severe. Electricity generation, semiconductor production, transport, hospitals, and military operations would compete for declining energy. Yet, no serious analyst can convert those variables into a single surrender date. The relevant question is not when does Taiwan run out. It is how long can Taiwan preserve essential state and military functions while the political contest continues. Taipei would face an ugly choice. If it complied with Chinese inspections, it would concede a form of Chinese authority over Taiwan's external access. If it ordered commercial vessels to ignore the rules, civilian crews would carry the immediate risk. If Taiwan's Navy or Coast Guard escorted those vessels, a collision, warning shot, or boarding attempt could become the first armed clash. Taiwan's objective would not necessarily be to destroy every Chinese enforcement vessel. It would be to remain politically functional, protect critical infrastructure, preserve forces, and deny Beijing a quick capitulation. That means dispersed aircraft and ships, coastal missiles, mines, cyber defense, protected communications, energy rationing, and a diplomatic campaign aimed at preventing commercial compliance from becoming international acceptance. Social cohesion would be a military variable. Panic buying, disinformation, and partisan conflict could amplify material shortages. Conversely, credible information, prepared rationing, and resilient local services could buy time without firing a shot. If this will be the case, the United States would not face a binary choice between doing nothing and attacking China. It could coordinate diplomatic condemnation and sanctions, provide intelligence and cyber support, arrange commercial guarantees or war risk insurance, move forces into the region, organize air or maritime resupply, escort merchant vessels, or attempt to break the operation by force. These options form an escalation ladder, not a guaranteed sequence. The Taiwan Relations Act treats boycotts and embargoes used to determine Taiwan's future by non-peaceful means as a matter of grave concern. But it does not create an automatic operational response. The President and Congress would still have to decide what action was appropriate. Escorting ships sounds restrained until a Chinese vessel orders the convoy to stop. If the escort complies, it accepts China's claimed authority. If it refuses, Chinese commanders must decide whether to obstruct or fire. American commanders must decide whether to force passage. The ambiguity disappears at close range. Japan would be central, but its direct participation should not be assumed. US operations would rely heavily on bases in Japan. Taiwan's eastern approaches connect to Japan's southwestern islands, and a wider conflict could threaten Japanese territory and sea lanes. Tokyo could provide basing, logistics, intelligence, and rear area support without immediately conducting combat operations. But Chinese strikes on US facilities in Japan or operations close to Japanese territory could transform the political and legal calculation. This is why a quarantine is attractive to Beijing. It makes the first American and Japanese response harder to justify, coordinate, and communicate. It is also why the approach is unstable. Once an outside power refuses inspection, a supposedly limited operation becomes a direct test of force. China would also pay a price. About $1.3 trillion of Chinese imports and exports passed through the Taiwan Strait in 2024. Disruption would affect Chinese ports, energy supplies, finance, and export confidence, not only Taiwan and foreign economies. Beijing could try to preserve through traffic for Chinese ships or keep parts of the strait open. But selective enforcement would be operationally demanding and politically unconvincing. Shipping companies and insurers respond to physical risk, not only to coordinates in a Chinese announcement. This creates the central enforcement dilemma. A restrained quarantine may be too weak to compel Taiwan. A forceful blockade is more credible, but it exposes Chinese forces, damages Chinese own economy, and makes foreign intervention more likely. If Taiwan does not yield, Beijing must choose among retreating, tolerating failure, or escalating to mines, strikes, seizures of offshore islands, or invasion. So, what would actually happen in a Taiwan blockade? Probably not an immediate, perfectly sealed ring of warships. The more plausible opening is an attempt to establish control over access, inspection demands, exclusion zones, Coast Guard patrols, cyber pressure, and selective interdiction, all backed by the PLA. That could disrupt commerce very quickly. It could expose Taiwan's dependence on imported energy and force Washington and Tokyo into dangerous decisions. But disruption is not victory. To compel Taiwan, China would have to sustain enforcement, manage civilian shipping, contain escalation, absorb economic retaliation, and prevent outside intervention simultaneously. A quarantine may look like an option short of war. It remains short of war only while everyone else complies. The first vessel that refuses inspection may therefore matter more than the first missile. Beijing may be able to begin a quarantine. It cannot confidently determine how it ends.